person nowadays would sort of dare to paint the sun at any time of the day. And he does it, and we'll see other examples of it in the course of the evening. Before I get into the talk, I want to just refer to this briefly. We distributed a copy of this. I hope everyone received one. So you have something for your $5 at least. This is a little flyer that was put out by the Maine State Historic Preservation Commission a few years ago. I don't know how many of them they ever distributed at Monhegan, interestingly, but they are an excellent short summary of Kent's work in designing and building structures on this island. I don't need to go into great detail. Of course, you know, in 1906 he constructed a small home which was later added to. This is the cottage where Ann Hubert lives now. And then after that he built a second cottage nearby, which was called the Mary Kelsey Cottage, I believe. And that, I believe, is now part of the Hitchcock house, is that correct? And then the following year, around 1908, he built the Sarah Kent Cottage, which is the home that Jamie Wyeth lives in and owns. And then the last of the four buildings that he designed and constructed was his studio, which he put up in 1909, I believe, for the painting school that he was to operate here on the island. So he also worked on construction of other buildings. The two best known are the twin houses, so-called Jenny houses, that are out on the harbor here. He was one of the carpenters who worked on that. Kent had no particular training in carpentry, but he was an architect by training. He was not a graduate architect, but he had several years of study at Columbia during the first part of the century. And he just decided that there ought to be something logical about building, and he just decided to go ahead and try to see if he could build a house, and it worked pretty well. And by the time he had done this 2 or 3 times, he was in competition with the leading builder on the island, who was the grandfather of Eliot Stanley. I don't see Sherm here tonight, so we probably can see why he's not here. But Kent was quite good at building and working with his hands. He was a man of many talents. Just by way of a little more background, he was born in 1882 in Tarrytown, New York, an affluent family. Father was an attorney in New York City. Kent was descended from old Ohio ancestry. The town of Kent, Ohio, and Kent State University are in fact named after earlier ancestors of Rockwell, Kent. He started out attending school in New York City. He went to Horace Mann School, 1895. Then he went on to Columbia as an architectural student. Didn't really excite him when he got into the New York Art School that William Merritt Chase operated. And there studied under Chase, and then subsequently under Robert Henry, who was probably the single greatest influence on his art. Also, Kenneth Hayes Miller was another important teacher. We'll talk a little more about that as we get into the painting. He came to Monhegan at Henry's suggestion in 1905, and then was here off and on for the next 5 years, spending quite a bit of time here until 1910. Then he went on a series of wanderings and explorations around the world for really the next 37 years before he came back to Monhegan on a regular basis in 1947. At that time, he started coming here usually in May and in September, leaving in the summer to avoid the tourists, and going back to his home at Osable Forks, New York, where he had established residence in 1928. He was here through from 47 until about 53, and then basically stopped coming to Monhegan. We'll talk a little more about why that happened when we come to that point of the evening. And then he continued working out of his home in upstate New York, and he died in 1971 at about age 88 or 89. So that in the thumbnail is a little bit about his life, for those of you who don't know much about him. He was considered a member of what we call the American Realist movement. Other contemporaries of his who are well known were Edward Hopper and George Bellows. The latter did come out and worked on Monhegan for a while. They were different artists, they had different interests and different perceptions of art, but they were exact contemporaries, all three of those men. Kent, Bellows, and Hopper were all born in 1882, and Kent was the one who lived the longest of the three. Now, this painting, I'll just say a word or two more. It's interesting to me, and I've studied this painting quite a bit, that he, at some point, I don't know whether this is early or later. Jamie, do you know about the little yellow flecks that are in this painting?
I think it's all early.
You
Some
think
things he worked on later when he came back, but this I think was all done.
Yeah, he did some paintings that he would come back to even for some years later if he still owned them. I don't know when this passed out of his ownership initially, what its exact provenance is. Do you know much about it?
Yes, he said he sold it in the 20s.
In the 20s. We'll see some other examples of paintings that he retouched in various ways as we go through the program. But this is very good example of his early work here at Monhegan. This would be the second year, 1907, that he was in residence here. And I think what we'll do, I think it's time now to get into the slides. Is it sufficiently dark outside? We wanted to light. So we'll move this back and get a little help.
Yes, Dr. Stones is coming.
On the stage.
To the right of the door back there.
Okay, the stage lights. I'll try to stay out of your way as much as I can here and talk about. This is the young Rockwell in 1905 when he first arrived at Monhegan, self-portrait. This is in the collection up at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh, where there's a considerable collection of his work that was left there after he died. His home was not far from Plattsburgh. And this year, as a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks, we're having the first international symposium on Rockwell Kent at that SUNY Plattsburgh location. If any of you happen to live up that way, you might want to come to hear talks about him and papers presented by people who have been doing research on aspects of Rockwell Kent's career. You see here quite a bit of influence from Chase and from Miller in this. You'll see a little more in some other works, Henry, and we don't have too many pictures really of Rockwell Kent at this age, but it's a very nice self-portrait, and he had some hair then. You'll see that he seemed to lose that fairly quickly after he got to Monhegan. Now this goes back just a little bit to give you an earlier work. This is Dublin Pond, 1903, Dublin Pond over in New Hampshire near the school that Abbot Thayer operated. Kent studied there for a summer or two under Abbot Thayer. And this early painting probably of the foothills around Mount Monadnock, an area that Kent liked a great deal. And you see something of his interest in reflection, water treatment there was quite effective. Is that in good focus for everyone? And can you hear me all right in the back?
Yes.
Those who are sitting right up close may have a little trouble with the focus, but I don't know what we can do about that. Let's have the next one. This is Stone Bridge at Keene, New Hampshire from 1904. Another very much a sort of an academy painting, very typical of the paintings that were being done in the American art community at that time, and very genteel, very sort of ordered view of things. And Kent and other of the painters of his generation began to break away from that just as soon as they got out of New York, working on their own careers. Let's go to the next one. All right, this is really the first Monhegan painting that we know of at this time. And I say that we know of because we're constantly finding new works by Kent, even earlier, and it's very dangerous to say that this is the earliest painting that he did. Absolutely, but this is a little painting on a cigar box lid that he gave to a woman. It's about 8 by 10 at most, maybe a little bit smaller than that. And I was looking at the painting up in the museum today, the loan from Brown, and struck by the similarity of composition of that painting with this one. This may be a study. That painting also is dated 1905, which would mean that it would be a painting that he worked on in his very first year here at Monhegan. He arrived here in June of 1905, and he stayed for, well, several months, and he went back to Terrytown for a while, and he came again in 1906. So this is Blackhead, Monhegan, from 1905, and we'll have the next slide. By the way, if anyone wants to raise a question or make a comment, feel free to do so. I don't consider this a one-sided discussion. I hope we'll have some contributions if any of you wish to say something. This is Monhegan Rocks, Monhegan from 1906. This is owned by Jamie Wyeth, I believe, but not here on. It's not hanging on the island. Is that right? And this is. You really begin to see the power, the muscularity of these paintings, and certainly the influence of Robert Hemry is very strong in this work from 1906. It's the only painting in my presentation from that year, and I don't know exactly where on the island. Does anybody have this sense of where this is on Monhegan? On to number. This is Afternoon on the Sea from 1907. Very lovely painting. This one hangs in the Post collection, the Post family collection. Originally was given to or sold to Marie Sterner, who was a great backer of Kent's during the 20s and 30s. You begin to see his sense of monumentality in his work, which we'll see even more directly, that he was quite interested in the statement that a large mass would make in a painting. And also the human figures here are there, but we don't really get close to them. They're in a sense, they represent the huge magnificence of nature, in which man is a relatively small actor. And we see this again and again in Kent's painting. He rarely paints a portrait of anyone. That self-portrait of himself is about as close as he comes to really looking at the human face. But you certainly see man as a worker, as a toiler in nature and against nature in his paintings. Right, next. This is also one of his great Monhegan oils. Toilers on the Sea is the current title. It was originally called Toiling on the Sea. This is in the New Britain Museum of American Art. Oil on canvas. Almost all of these are oil on canvas unless I say otherwise. And if any of you are interested in the dimensions of them, I have that information. I won't bore you with giving you all the dimensions, but most of them are in the 35 to 45 inch size range of these major Kent oils. Now here, of course, you have a very strong block, central force in this painting around which he organizes the activities of a few rather precarious human activities here. And this is, of course, lobstering. Kent himself worked as a stern man in such a lobster boat as this. He talks quite a bit about the fun of it as well as the disadvantages of it. When he worked here, he joined with the lobstermen, went out in their boats, became a member of the lobstering community here at Monhegan. And his political views began to evolve here too. And he had, as I mentioned before, he'd come from a rather affluent family in Terrytown, but he really wasn't comfortable with that, and he rebelled against it. Socialism and ideas of sort of proletarian equality and so on appealed to him. And when he came to Monhegan, he saw the toiling work of the poor people of this island, and he wanted to be part of that. He wanted to identify with that. And he honored them in the paintings. They're kind of, in his own way, made into heroic figures. Let's go on to the next one here. This is Winter Monhegan, 1907. This painting hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is perhaps his best known. Slight adjustment here. It is probably his best known Monhegan painting. That's open to debate, of course, but most people would say this, if there's any one particular Monhegan painting that everyone knows, or most everyone knows, and associates with Rockwell, Kent, it would be this painting. Here you have Manana, of course, the dock, the harbor, the fish house here, right on the little dock. Similarity to current day is remarkable, I think, in a sense that you certainly can see yourself looking into this picture in reality here. He uses the point of the house here as a kind of an axis for this painting. He often also works with the horizontal, the line of the horizon as another organizing principle in his paintings. And he had a very good sense of composition right from the beginning, and these works of Monhegan are all excellent works. I might say this too, he did 120 canvases in the first 5 years here at Monhegan. That is a remarkably prolific period for any artist to produce that kind of work. He often did small sketches before he did large paintings, so there are a good many small oils, sometimes 15 by 22 or so on, that are the studies for these larger oils, and they occasionally turn up, and they're quite lovely little paintings. Many of them he signed sooner or later, and they are in the art market, as are the larger oils. All right, let's go on. This is called Pollock Singing from 1907. It's in the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio. And this work, along with Toiling on the Sea, or Toilers of the Sea, was included in Kent's first show in 1907 in New York City at the Clausen Galleries. About 12 or 13, 14 paintings were hung there for a couple of weeks. None of them sold. This is a significant fact in terms of directions that Kent's life began to take in a few years. Here were these wonderful paintings that he had done, and he continued turning out beautiful paintings, but there was no market for his work at that time. So this this one is in that group of the early 1907 paintings. Okay, next. This is a very familiar one for Maine. This is called the Maine Coast, 1907. This is the Cleveland Museum of Art painting. Kent, I mentioned earlier that he was unafraid of dealing with direct frontal sunlight. He was also increasingly interested in white and the power, the effect of white in painting. It's another color that many painters seem to be a little bit reluctant to work with in painting. Here you see a winter scene, which is probably done here on Monhegan. That's, at least art experts believe that it was done on this island. Certainly could have been, but precisely where, we don't know. Next slide. All right, this is almost the same real painting that we've looked at. This one is called Sunset. Just a minute. This is Maine Fishing Village, Sunset, circa 1907. Oil on canvas, and its location, where it is now, I don't know. Does anybody happen to know where that painting is hanging? There again, you have the sunlight, Monhegan, or Banana, and Red House. I guess this was what Red House looked at that time. Here's the old house next to it, and a few fishing shacks. Here again, you got a little bit of this flecking, yellow flecking work that shows up along the lower edge of the foreground of this painting. This is a little confusing to art historians because Kent used that kind of technique much later in his life, quite commonly in the second Monhegan period, if you call it that. And that's why I asked the question about, do we know about this use of a kind of bright yellow in the foreground of some of these paintings. It seems more characteristic of work that he did in the 50s. All right, let's go on. Now here's another one. This is called Sunset Monhegan from 1909. It's in a private collection. This is an oil on panel, 8 by 10 inches. Strange little painting, but one that art historians are comfortable was done by Kent. It has almost a sort of an abstract quality in which the sun has become a totally dominant element in this painting. There are a few other paintings that he did. This 8 by 10 on a panel probably means it was a study of some kind, was working out some ideas, and may have incorporated parts of this in other works. All right, next. Another lovely winter scene. This is Maine Coast Winter from 1909. This is the painting that the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston owns, and you've seen reproductions of it. In fact, I think I saw some cards here on the island somewhere earlier today, some reproductions of that work for sale here. Now this is Monhegan Island Headlands from 1909. This is in the Sheldon Gallery, University of Nebraska collection. And this was exhibited in New York in the 1910 Exhibition of Independent Artists under the title North Atlantic Headlands. It's an oil on canvas, 35 by 44. This is Rocky Inlet from the same year, 1909. Rocky Inlet, Monhegan. It is owned by a company called the High Voltage Engineering Corporation in Burlington, Massachusetts. Oil on canvas. It It may seem a little amusing that a company would own a Rockwell Kent, but in fact, corporate sponsorship of Kent in various ways occurred throughout his life, especially in the advertising arts. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But he often did work and sold works, of course, to companies and private entities that wanted him to do particular kinds of painting, other graphic work. Now this is a painting of an interesting kind of painting. I'm afraid we've got a head in that. I don't know if we can do anything about that or not, but that's good. Put it up there. This is Cranberrying Monhegan, 1909, and this is in the Terra Museum of American Art in Evanston, Illinois. Oil on canvas. Bill tells me that cranberrying was a common pastime in the meadow here at that time. Whether this rise behind is looking toward Horns Hill or whether it's looking up toward the burial ground area, I don't know, but in terms of what that could be. But it's a painting that has carried that title, and if anybody has any particular views on it, it's unusual. It's kind of unlike a lot of the other Monhegan paintings, but quite a lovely painting. Lobster Cove. Bill, did the cranberries ever occur down in the Lobster Cove?
Yeah, they still do, but the background doesn't really fit what you see from Lobster Cove.
I leave this to those of you who know this
Could be
island better
Horns
than
Hill
I do.
without houses, although they were there then.
Now this is Blackhead again, Blackhead Monhegan from 1909. This is in the Colby College collection in Waterville, Maine. And once again, you see certainly a fascination with the monumental form and the huge strength of the rocks here, and that I don't know if any painter has ever done a better job of capturing that, but this is certainly one of the strong early Monhegan sites. Let's go on to the next one. This is burial of a young man from 1908 to 11. So he started this work while he was at Monhegan, but he finished it after he had left Monhegan. 1910 he went to Newfoundland for a relatively short visit, and whether it is based on events here or perhaps elsewhere is not known for sure. And also whether this background of these cliffs and so on is intended to be here or perhaps Newfoundland. One reason he wanted to go to Newfoundland was he knew that it had some very strong headlands, as did Monhegan. It also shows a kind of a beginning of a shift in Rockwell Kent's emotional state. About the time that this painting comes out, he seems to be taking a more serious view. The next painting is also a processional. This would be down to the sea. It isn't a sad painting, but it's interesting in the composition of this work. These figures seem to be dancing or celebrating something. This is from 1910. It hangs in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, oil on canvas. This is one of the largest paintings that Kent, in terms of its length, it's 42 inches by 56 inches wide. And this could be the opening of a lobster, possibly the opening day of the lobster season, but I'm not sure whether these are intended to be fishermen on their way out to the sea or what. Anybody have any particular observations on that? Okay, the next one is the Sainers from 1910 to 13. He worked on this one over a 3-year period, and it is in the Smithsonian collection. The Hirshhorn Museum in Washington has this painting, and it was originally shown in the 1911 Independent Artists Show in New York. oil on canvas. Undoubtedly influenced by the period at Monhegan, but when you say 13, well, you see he was going on into Newfoundland and other places. Nova Scotia, he had a short trip up to Nova Scotia during that time too. All right, you might take the next one. This is a painting, black and white photograph of an oil that called Croquet or the Beach Party from Monhegan, 1910. This is a painting that has just come on loan to the Newport Museum in Rhode Island, and the slide was sent up by Richard West, who is the director there, and probably the leading authority on Rockwell Kent's paintings in the United States. Richard West was director of the Bowdoin College Art Gallery here in the state, and helped a great deal with this. Many of these slides that you're seeing were part of the Enkindled Eye exhibit. Some of you have seen that in various cities and traveled around the country in 1986. So we're benefiting from those slides. Can we move to the next one? Now we leave Monhegan entirely. This is called Winter in the Berkshires, 1910. We're just going to look at some other works of the same period. This is in the National Museum of American Art at the Smithsonian. Again, very, very nice composition. He really communicates the playfulness, the light touch here with the using the little dancing dogs. Again, you noticed in some of the previous paintings that he occasionally uses a little sort of border collie. I don't know if it was his dog or somebody else's, but he gets the feeling of uplift from just the simple activity of a little animal in a painting. Again, he's using white. Right, on the Road Roller, which was the great painting, 1910, New Hampshire. This contraption is a device. I'm sure a lot of you know what it's for. It's to flatten the snow in the days of the sleighs and so on, rather than shoveling or plowing snow. You would simply pull a heavy weight around a wheel like this, big drum over the snow. And I don't know if you can see the dog here. Can you lift that up just a little bit? Here again, he uses the little collie as a kind of well, he introduces an element of play into this, I think, and of those of you who are artists probably have a better idea of just what that dog is for. The human figures, again, are small in relation to the vast power of this machine. Now, here he's not looking so much at the power of nature, but of something man-made. Of course, the horses are not man-made, but they're a strong force in this great painting. Many art historians consider this perhaps Kent's greatest work. It's in the Phillips collection in Washington. It has been recently restored, and this is a slide of what it looks like after restoration. So this is in its present form. A few years ago it was somewhat dingy, and they undertook to clean up all of the Kent paintings here a few years ago. So that's 1910, the Road Roller. Now we'll take just a breather. Let me just take a swallow of water. We're going to look at some other things that he did. Well, sort of starting back in 1906, while he was coming back and forth to Monhegan, he was doing his first experiments with combining text and illustrations in the book arts area. This is the Blue Mouse from 1906, the very first manuscript, and here is one of the internal. This is a watercolor with pencil and watercolor, an interior illustration of this. Light, very almost kind of a beer balm quality to the illustration here. Here's the little mouse of Reform playing on the organ of Reform, and I don't know if I can read the motto, but it's what this was basically was a little kind of a play, a little make-believe magazine that Kent and a friend of his cooked up. They had a subscription of 2 people, their respective mothers, received the Blue Mouse. So there were only 2 copies of it made originally. It lasted for 1 year, and then it disappeared. I think one reason it disappeared was Kent came back to Monhegan and we spent a lot of time here after that, so he probably was, this was done in Terrytown, by the way, this particular book. Of interest here was that he did use this Blue Mouse to report on the famous mock wedding that he had here at Monhegan in 1906. He brought George Palmer Putnam, a young man, young friend of his, of the Putnam Publishing House in New York, later the husband of Amelia Earhart. And George Putnam and Kent were boon companions from the days over at the Abbott Thayer School in New Hampshire. And so Kent let it be known, he was out here at Monhegan, he let it be known that he was going into shore to bring back his bride. And a day or so later, out on the boat comes a figure somewhat taller than Kent, dressed in a wedding gown, and was introduced all around the island as the new Mrs. Kent. And this was George Putnam in drag, and the islanders took a while to get over this. They had gone to some trouble to prepare for this bride who was coming out, and Kent said that some of them were kind of sore at him for a while. But anyway, it was written up in the Boothbay Register, and he took the clippings, put them into the Blue Mouse, and we have some photographs there too. So he reported on this famous nuptial, and he paid kind of a penalty for it. Putnam stayed around for a few weeks, and Putnam said to Kent that he was a pretty good cook, and Kent said, well, good, make something, make a dinner. And so Putnam said, okay, I'll put something together, I'm going to make some biscuits. And when they were finally out of the oven, Kent tried to cut into one of them and almost broke his knife. It was like a little stone. He called it a pellet, not a biscuit. And he said to George Putnam, what did you put in this anyway? And Putnam said, well, I just used some baking powder that I found under the sink there. Well, what that was some finely ground granite pumice which Kent had saved from his well drilling. He dug wells around the island. And he had put some of this fine granite away in a can that said baking powder on it, put it under the sink. And Putnam had baked it right into these biscuits. So that's the kind of Mad Hat thing that went on here in those days. So, all right, now we go to a little drawing. This is, if we can get it to sit still. Kent went over to Newfoundland in 1910, as I mentioned before, and he sent back to his wife Kathleen a series of little postcards that he did, the sketches, in which he would give a brief report on the weather or whatever. Here is his little report to her, and then a drawing of the vicinity around St. John's in Newfoundland, 1910. And eventually he wrote her a note and said, by the way, be sure to save all those postcards that I can send you because they're valuable little sketches of this trip. So she saved them, and some of them have eventually gotten into collections and museums. This is a tiny little thing, a 3x5. Now, in 1914, he tried his hand at book illustration on a published book. This is the first effort at illustrating a book. Although his name does not appear, he is not attributed as the illustrator, but this is the cover of Architectonics, a kind of light book about the architectural profession in New York. But here's certainly the beginnings of a wonderfully buoyant and life-affirming kind of graphic art talent in this man. It's really quite impressive. Those of you who are book collectors and who especially are interested in design bindings and American trade bindings, things of that kind, will recognize this as a particularly beautiful example of that art at that time. Now, in 1917, he fell madly in love with a German girl in New York. Her name was Hildegard Hirsch. She was not the first of his extramarital romances. He had had one here on Monhegan, as a matter of fact, which many of you know. He fathered a child by a Monhegan girl, and whom he did not marry. And he fell in love with Hildegard Hirsch. She was a model. She was a dancer in one of the Follies in New York. And while he was out here at Monhegan in 1916-17 for shorter visits, these were not long time, but he worked on this book. He did the paper that he used was artist's drawing paper, and he bound it with little bits of canvas, painter's canvas. He devised this little symbol for kind of their symbol. This is a human figure embracing a deer. Hirsch, the name, the girl's German name, and translated as deer or stag. And he picked up on that idea and developed a little monogram, you might say, for them. He gave her this book. This was a gift. It was also kind of a plea to pay more attention to him. We might go on to the next slide. This is one of the pages, the interior pages, showing the little pen and ink drawings that these were tipped on. They were done separately, the pen and ink drawings. And then this is all his hand, kind of carefully scripted out. You can see, in fact, down in here, a mistake that he made. He was obviously copying this. He says, "and how the hand each other by the hand." He was copying it from something else, and he slipped a line there, apparently. And but anyway, this book is his first complete book. That is, in the sense of illustration, binding. He did all of this work himself. It was a private book, so it does not appear in his published bibliography in that sense, but it's an important book. This is the book that the Baxter Society produced in facsimile edition, and I believe that the Lupin Gallery has some examples of it, if any of you are interested in looking at it closely. We can go on to the next. This is Hildegard Hirsch, as she appeared in the style of the time. She had come over from Munich in 1910, dancer in New York, as I said, Follies. Kent was married to Kathleen Whiting, who was a niece of Abbot Thayer. That marriage lasted until 1926, and she had to put up with occasional things like this during the time of that marriage. And we'll go on to the next one if we want. Here's a little watercolor, a drawing in watercolor showing Hildegard as a Godiva type character riding the deer through the heavens. You see the moon here and the stars and so on. And this was one of many little gifts that Kent gave her, artistic drawings and other works. And she was a model for his paintings on glass, which are a very special kind of art form that he started working with around 1915. Here is the painting heading up a mirror. This is his granddaughter Clara, reflected in it, and a great grandchild. This is owned by Clara Kent, and now we're taking a little closer look at the glass painting. This is a technique known as verre aglomisé, which is two panes of glass in which the artist works in reverse on the outer pane, the inside edge of the outer pane, and then puts it together with some elements of the drawing done in the background. There are only about 24 of these in existence. They're quite a rare and special art form, and done just in about a 2-year period. The frames were made by Max Cuny, the artist, the New York artist and friend of Kent. He made all these gilded special frames for them. This is a pen and ink drawing that was found in Hildegard's effects. The affair ended rather, well, on a sad note. In a sense, it didn't really go anywhere ultimately, and The fact that she saved this little drawing is kind of interesting to me because it seems to show a kind of an anguished couple. Kent often used the doorway in his graphic arts work as a symbol of passage or of crossing over from one state to another, moving on through life. And so this is an very early pen and ink drawing from that collection. Now, in 1918, he published under his own name. This is the first time that you have the name Rockwell Kent on graphic work. As I said before, he found that his paintings wouldn't sell. He continued to do paintings, but he didn't really begin to have success selling his paintings until 1919, 1920. And even then it was never tremendously successful. So the graphic arts work began to become more and more important in his overall activity. This is one of the drawings from that collection, The Seven Ages of Man. There in fact were only 4 drawings. The idea was to demonstrate that World War I, which this was during World War I, was cutting off the man before he really lived to his full stages. Here's the young soldier dead on the battlefield, the rats of war about to gnaw on the body, the helmet here, and so on. These were all signed by Kent in pencil. And it's an anti-war kind of statement by him in 1918. This is his first wood engraving called Blue from 1919. He had started doing some experimentation with woodcuts even here at Monhegan during the period around 1908-9, that period. John Sloan in New York, Frederick Dorr Steele were a couple of friends and other fellow artists who encouraged him to get involved with etching and wood cutting. And Kent experimented using one of his children as a model for this work. This is a wood engraving, I think, on boxwood, small work, 3x4, whatever. 1919, his very first numbered print, first catalog print number 1 in this catalog of prints. After a year in Alaska, 1918 and 19, he came back to New York. He had a successful showing of drawings. This was the program from the Nobler Gallery show of 1919. And these were drawings that he did while he was in Alaska. He lived at a place called Fox Island, Resurrection Bay, which is not too far from where the Valdez accident occurred a few years ago. After the publication of these drawings in a book which came out in 1920 entitled Wilderness, which included many of these drawings, Kent all of a sudden was lionized. He was a nationally known figure all of a sudden. The New Statesman in London said that his book Wilderness was the best book to appear in North America since Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Very high praise indeed. It was a book called A Story of Quiet Adventure in Alaska. And he began to be in demand for social occasions. The Pulitzer family in New York began to ask him over for dinner, and he, at one dinner, he was offered an artichoke. He had never seen one before, and with some sauce nearby, and he was at a big state dinner in New York with the Pulitzer family, and he waited as long as he could to see what other people would do with this artichoke, but nobody made a move, you know. So finally he took the sauce and poured it over the top of the artichoke, and all the people at the table roared with laughter that he, then they said, now try to eat it that way, you know. So that's what happened to him. Now in 1927, he does this work based on the Sacco Vanzetti executions in Massachusetts. This is August 23rd, 1927, and this is a wood engraving. You see a very powerful statement. Really, this is his first political statement using the black and white, the graphic arts technique. He uses symbolism very effectively, kind of equating the victims of the execution with Christ and with, you can see the imagery here that he uses to make a powerful statement. This wood engraving is so intense that many people who collect Kent's works don't want to have it in their house. They don't even want to show it because it's too strong, too raw for them. But it is an important work in terms of his development as a political artist as well as in the medium of wood engraving. Next. This is The Lovers from 1928, another wood engraving, often considered one of his most special works. I want to dedicate this to Elise, who's here, and her friend from Switzerland. The Lovers was a big success as a wood engraving, and it's an interesting engraving as you study it closely. It's kind of ambiguous as to sexuality. It's a very sensual work, you know. But it's one of his most famous wood engravings, 1928. And let's go to the next one. This is Man at Mast from 1929, one of a series of works that he did for the American Car and Foundry Company. These were advertisements used in various national magazines to promote the products of a yacht making company, American Car and Foundry. These are often considered his most successful group of wood engravings, starting with this one and going on. I'm going to show you one other one. The next one is part of the same series, Bowsprit from 1929. This certainly shows mastery of the wood engraving medium by this point. He's really producing beautiful wood engravings. Most of these were done in editions of anywhere from 100 to 150 copies. And this series, as I said, in the 1930s of the maritime themes were among his most successful. In 1930, he illustrated the Lakeside Press edition of Moby Dick. This is considered by book experts and printers as one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful book produced in this country in this century. Quite a compliment. Kent was given a free hand by the Lakeside Press to do all aspects of design of this book, including this unusual aluminum slipcase that he put the 3-volume edition in, as you see, and it has protected it. It was a very sensible idea. Those of you who collect books, you know what the old cardboard cases do after a few years. As you see, this one has kept that set in beautiful condition. Just going back to Moby Dick for a moment, the Random House got the rights to do the trade edition of Moby Dick that year, and they were so excited about this opportunity that they forgot to put Herman Melville's name on the book. So you had this all over the country, Moby Dick, Rockwell, Kent. And Vanity Fair decided to have a little fun at Bennett Cerf's expense, and they put a little ditty in one of their magazines that said, in 1930, the literary event was the Random House discovery of Moby Kent. So they had to go back on the next edition and make sure that Melville's name got back in the book. This book, N by E, was written in 1930 based on his first trip to Greenland in 1928. This is Rockwell Kent's personal copy, as bound for him, specially bound for him by the Lakeside Press. This is what they do for their authors, or at least they did for Rockwell Kent. This is not your usual trade edition binding, as you know, but this was his personal copy. They used this little overturned champagne glass, which had appeared in the Moby Dick edition. Now, in 1930, he also tried his hand in the decorative arts area. This is a bronze cigarette box made by the Chase Brass and Copper Company of Connecticut. And you see his initials here, and the Bacchus, the little Bacchus figure, and the goats and so on in the background. Very nice piece. Beautiful Art Deco feel to that work. Kent really, I don't think, would have considered himself an Art Deco artist, really. He's kind of post-Art Deco in many ways, but you do see a certain flavor of that in the design of this box. And he then tried some other metal work. Let's go on to his next. He did some designs for jewelry that he submitted to the George Jensen Company of Denmark. The Kent estate has recently given permission for some of these to be now made. These were never actually made into jewelry until just recently. And the first of them, this design of see no evil, hear no evil, or the three faces, is the first pin produced, and I believe also that we have a few of those at the Lupin Gallery for you to see if you're interested in looking at an original Rockwell Kent, not a reproduction, but an original work made posthumously from his art. Now we go back to some paintings, more paintings. 1919, when he was in Alaska, he started, first of all, reading William Blake, and you can begin to see immediately the impact of Blake's art on Rockwell Kent, starting in 1919. This one is called North Wind, and this is in the Phillips collection in Washington. Did you have a question back there? Just stretching your arm. This is a view of the Alaska mountains from Fox Island and Resurrection Bay. You'll see this kind of beginning to lead toward the paintings that he did in Greenland a few years later. But this comes from 1920, 1918, 19, and done in Alaska, Resurrection Bay. And we go to the next one. This one is called Voyagers, Alaska, 1919. It's in the Engstrom collection, oil on canvas. This idea of the hovering or floating spirit or muse or protective force in men's lives, looking over the rather faceless small figures on the huge sea, begins to show up in Kent's work after Alaska. The Blake influence is definitely there. In the mid-20s, he made a trip over to Europe, and this is a scene called Wreck. Lights for the corner there. Got it back? Okay. This is Shipwreck, coast of Ireland, 1927. And this is in the SUNY Plattsburgh collection in upstate New York. Interesting, one of the first times you see this kind of backlighting, the rays coming down. This is often associated with Rockwell Kent's graphic work also. And here are the survivors of the wreck kind of clambering ashore here, but the mourners don't even notice them. And so that's quite an interesting painting, I think. Mid-20s. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he went to Greenland in 1928. He wrote a book about that, NYE. This is a little sketchbook that he carried when he went to Greenland in 1932. This was a small book that he bought in Denmark or from some people who were Danish who were in Greenland. Let's go on to the next slide. Now here, if we can raise that just a little bit, you can see a pencil sketch of some figures playing around an iceberg here. And then up in here are some of his handwritten notes that often found their way into later books on Greenland. Now, just remember this sketch, and let's look at the next slide. And this is the painting that came from it. This is Spring Sunday, North Greenland, 1932. This is one of the works that Rockwell Kent gave to the Russian people in 1961, one of the 83 canvases that went to Russia when the Farnsworth Museum decided not to open a Kent wing, and Kent was angry, so he gave a fantastic collection of art to the Russians. And this work shows at least one example where a tiny pencil sketch was quite faithful, really, to the ultimate painting that resulted. You want to go back to that other one just for a second, to that pencil sketch? These little pencil sketches are quite unusual, but this little book is full of them. I haven't been able to trace all the others to later paintings, but this one was quite clearly studied for that. Now this is one of his Greenland paintings from the early 30s called the Citadel or Carrot Island. The discoloration, you notice this yellowish color in here is the condition of the slide. It's an old slide. I couldn't get a better one, but it's an important painting. Certainly a signature piece for his Greenland work. Let's go on to the next one. This is more typical of the color that you should have been seeing in that previous slide. This is titled Iceberg, Greenland, 1932. He did a great many paintings in Greenland, probably over a 4 or 5 year period, about as many Greenland paintings as he had done in that early Monhegan, the 120 paintings I mentioned earlier. Richard West, whom I mentioned before, the real expert on Kent's paintings, believes that the Greenland works are really, in a sense, Kent finding his own voice. They are not related to his training, his close training with Henry and so on. We looked at the Monhegan paintings. So to Richard West's mind, at least, the Greenland works are really where Kent kind of puts it all together finally in terms of an original vision, subject matter that suited him, and you've got a series of quite stunning paintings. Here's another one. This is Wind in Kekkestarnak Fjord, Greenland, 1932. It certainly looks like blackhead or whitehead in there. This is called Christian Graves, South Greenland, around 1932. And let's go to the next one. This one is called Highways, North Greenland, in the 1933 to 37 SUNY Plattsburgh collection. This is an example of one of the paintings that he came back to later and added small figures. Quite often he did these landscapes without any human or other figures in them, and then decided later meaning anywhere from 5 to 20 years later, to come back and put some human element in for scale and also for interest. This is a lithograph, a medium that Kent also worked quite successfully in. This is a 3-color lithograph, Sermeliuk Fjord, from the early 1930s. This is considered his most valuable single lithograph. Those of you who are interested in collecting his prints, this is the one to look for. These are now all going at around $4,000, $4,500 for a copy of this particular lithograph, mainly because of the multiple color elements and composition in general. But this is the only lithograph based on Greenland that I'm showing tonight. Here is a incorporation of one of his Greenland paintings in a gallery poster, the Hammer Galleries in New York. This is neither snow nor rain nor ice from 1932. It's an oil on canvas on board in the original, and is in something known as the Alpert collection, 40 by 64 inches. All right. In 1957, he had a showing of artworks in Russia. This is the poster from his first show in Russia. The Russian loved his work. They came out in the thousands to see his paintings. He had never seen such a reception in this country, and I think he was quite affected by this. It had quite a profound effect on him that here was a country where his work seemed to be appreciated, and he was getting only grief over here as he saw it. So this is the gallery poster from the first of his Russian shows, and then we go on to another one, 1982, even after, this is after his death, several years after his death. Another showing of works in Russia. We have a project underway. Jamie Wyatt has been helping. We started working on this in 1986 to see if we could get the Russians to permit the works that he gave them in 1961 to come back here on tour. The project has been stymied, let's use that word, by the political changes in Russia and all of the developments there in the last few years. The museums have given their permission for the works to travel. We have had trouble getting American corporate support for this project because of the uncertainties of the business climate in Russia. But we are still hopeful that someday we will get a tour, a national tour of a good many of the Russian canvases that Kent gave them in 1961. So let's hope that we'll all get a look at those one of these days. This is an example of his wood engraving technique. This is an unfinished wood engraving called Big Baby, an Eskimo scene. He went ahead and finished another one very similar to this. Why he discarded this one, I don't know, but you can see how he used chalk and both to assist him in carving. Wood engraving, as you know, is done on the end block of wood with instruments that are similar to those used for engraving metal. Very hard work, but Kent, this was probably his favored graphic arts medium to work in, and this is what a wood block actually looks like. And for those of you who haven't seen one, these would then be, they wouldn't actually print from these blocks, they would make what's called an electrotype, a kind of a copy of this that would be, I believe, in metal, and then print copies from that, save the original, strike the original when the print run was through, and that's the basic technique that was used in printing his wood engravings. Next slide. In 1934, Kent did this self-portrait, a lithograph, age 52. You see a man somewhat suspicious of the world, somewhat combative, and he loved good fights. He was always in the middle of some fight, political or personal or something. He always had quite a few things going on in his life. One of his friends, Carl Zygrosser from Philadelphia, said that he thought that Kent's tours abroad, you know, the various trips he took to various places in the world, Alaska and Greenland and so on, were usually the result of hopeless complexities in his personal life back in the States, some of them involving women or marriages or whatever, and that he would leave then for a while until things kind of sorted themselves out, and he'd come back and do some new artwork and maybe a new book. So now we go on. 1937, he does a cover for New Masses magazine. This is called Peonage. This is a watercolor on with ink and pen and ink with watercolor added. Gives you quite a sense of the strong graphic style. This figure here is a little bit like an angel that he used occasionally in some of his graphic arts. And a man came up to him one time and said, "How do you know what an angel looks like, Mr. Kent? You show this angel, but how do you know?" And Kent said, "Well, how do you know what an angel looks like?" And they kept going back and forth for a little while, and finally Kent said, "Well, I know what an angel looks like because I'm married to one." And that seemed to end the argument for that point. All right, let's go to the next one. 1946, the devastation of Europe resulted in this great work. This was called Europa. This was the original drawing for a lithograph, which we'll see momentarily. This is Conte crayon and ink. This figure, as a matter of fact, was one of the original drawings, or very similar figure in the Moby Dick drawings that he adapted to this other use. Here's the lithograph made from the same drawing. Gives you a kind of a sense of the movement from drawing to lithographic print. Europa, 1946. This is an example of one of his posters. This is from 1949. Harry Bridges and other officials of Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast were under indictment, and Kent, who was a member, an honorary member of the ILWU, came to their Benefit with this great poster, this is certainly an example of political poster making at its best. He uses a clear, simple, strong imagery, very powerful, almost gut-wrenching image that I've seen people wince when they saw this work. And he did a number of posters. This is one of the more political ones. Bridges and the other officials were ultimately exonerated by the U.S. Supreme Court, so I guess his work didn't hurt their cause. All right, we might go to the next. This is the last of his political works from 1950, the Smith Act, a lithograph. The Smith Act had provided, among other provisions, that books of subversives in American embassies around the world were to be discarded. And Kent protested this with a pyre of books, and here's the little dove of peace toasting away down there, and the figure of liberty stretched. This is 1950, and it is his last, this is still 21 years before he died, but this was his last really strong political art statement. Okay, let's go back to Monhegan. We're going to talk now, this is the last group of slides. These are the Monhegan paintings from the 1940s, 1947, 1953 period. This, for contrast, is a slide of one of the early views of Monhegan from Blackhead from 1909, just to give us kind of a sense of the movement that he made from that earlier period. Let's go down to another view of Blackhead from 1950. Now you see a much more sort of docile sea, more rounded figure, more, the rocks are not, they don't have the power, the punch. He's put in a sailboat over here. This was something he almost never did in his earlier paintings, to kind of have and this is a little schooner going by out there. In general, you get the feeling of a more sentimental approach to the island in his return here in the late 40s and early 50s. Go on to the next one. This is the view of Monhegan that is in Colby College. They think it was done in 1907 up at Colby, but it was done in probably 1950. The detective work on this has been done by Payne, Whiten, and some other people here at Monhegan who have figured out that this can't be 1907 because of the architecture in the picture. These two buildings here were not done until, was it the 20s, Bill?
28, 29.
And another building up in this area dates from the 30s, I believe. This feature on the island end, when is that added? The cupola, you know? When that comes in, or is that pertinent to the dating of this little cupola?
Not really, but the other buildings.
Okay. This is in the Colby collection, and they are, as I say, under the impression it was done in 1907, but it wasn't. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. This is sometimes referred to as the wreck of the William McKinley, but it wasn't any such wreck apparently, but it was D.T. Sheridan that wrecked in 1948 on Lobster Cove, which you can still see rotting away down there. Kent did two versions of this. One of them shows some gulls about to land, maybe a gull standing on the wreck and others coming in. So there were sort of two versions of the same painting, basically. But this dates then from 1948 or thereafter. We don't know exactly when. It's often misdated as 1940 in many books. Here is Gull Rock, again around 1950. Much different feel in these paintings, these later Monhegan paintings. Some people are very fond of them. Others think this is Just such a contrast to his early work that it's hard to reconcile the two things. Of course, the man is several decades older when he came back here. This is called Sun on the Sea from around 1950. Probably Lobster Cove, I would guess, but another nice view. And this is Monhegan Coast from, again, the same period. We don't know the precise dates of some of these, but around 1950. This is a little defect in the slide here, this view. He intended that. You see the water, the treatment of the water there was so different from his earlier paintings. And this is Whitehead. He calls this painting Maine Headland Evening, circa 1950, oil on canvas. A very pleasing painting. I mean, I don't think anyone could look at that and not feel a certain... We've all seen that the water, that column over there, and it's very much part of the beauty of this island. But again, it seems as if Kent himself had sort of come to a rest in his work. He was not looking for the turbulent things. He was working at Monhegan, as I said before, in the spring and the fall. He would leave in the summer and go back to upstate New York. Politics was becoming very much more a problem in his life. He was subpoenaed before the McCarthy Committee in Washington during the early 50s. He became a very controversial figure nationally, politically, and the people on Monhegan, to some extent, began to avoid him. He noticed that when he walked the trails or went down to the store, that people would scurry past him and avoid speaking to him. And he began to feel that Monhegan was not the special kind of little refuge that it had been all through his life before. There was an incident in the early 50s. A friend of the Kent family was using their cottage to stay in for a while. A woman from, I believe, New York, Moran. She went out one evening for a walk and disappeared. And she had come up, she was somewhat despondent. I think the thought was, in the Kent family at least, that she might have either slipped or jumped from one of the cliffs. The body was never found, I believe. Was it found? Okay. Yeah. The body was found. The Kent's daughter was subpoenaed to go before a grand jury over on the mainland, and she had to take a lie detector test. She felt that she was being a suspect in this murder. And they said to her over there, "You're a suspect in a murder." It certainly was not, but this event, this episode, just added further to... Now, Kent wasn't on the island when this happened, but nationally the newspapers said things like, "Commie spy uses Monhegan to jump in the Russian submarine," and so on. And this became more and more of a cause célèbre out here. So Kent decided in 1953 to sell the cottage again, leave the island, and essentially never return. He did come back a few times individually, just for short visits after that, but basically he did no more paintings that we have record of. We have one or two more in this series. This is another view from the same period of Whitehead. This is in the Reiki collection, oil on panel, 12 by 16, small painting. And that is the last of the Monhegan paintings. We have one more slide here of a painting he did just 4 years before he died, called Ancient Elm from 1967. This is in his third wife, who survived him, Sally Horton, owns this painting. And this is probably set in upstate New York. This is Rockwell Kent as he looked in the early 60s with his wife Sally on his left and a family friend over on this side. Probably he was pretty much like this those years when he came out to Monhegan. Some of you who knew him could comment better about that, but this was just as I say, 4 years before his death, and he seemed like a pretty contented and happy man at that point. That concludes the slides, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I beg your pardon for going over the time so far, but thank you very much for sitting and listening.
Andy?
Explain about the incident about the museum that didn't build the wing and give to the Soviet Union. I didn't follow that.
Like everything, there are various versions of the story. Kent's version was that the Farnsworth over at Rockland had promised that they would have a show and build a wing on that museum if he would give them this big collection of canvases, 80-some canvases, plus pieces of various kinds of books, manuscripts, etc. They, when in 1953, when Kent became politically the hot potato that everybody saw, they contacted him and said, "We're awfully sorry, but we can't do this. It's just too controversial." Their board of directors out of Boston apparently had vetoed the idea. Kent was an emotional man, as you probably could sense from various things I said tonight. He was very angry about this, and he just looked for an opportunity to show them. And in 1961, he gave that collection of artworks to Russia for the Soviet people. The works have been divided among basically 4 museums over there, 2 of which are still in Russia, and one is in Ukraine and one is in Armenia. So we've got 3 countries now, not only 4 museums, we've got 3 countries to deal with. And however, before this split up over there, when it was still the Soviet Union, Richard West had gone over and had talked to museums there and had gotten their permission to let these works travel, and we believe that that is still their wish, but we still have to work out the financial aspect of it. Does that more or less cover it? Other questions?
So I remember when I was a kid, I used to read a book that came out of a slipcover, a slate gray blue slipcover. It had his stuff up in the beginnings of chapters in there. There was something like Norse mythology.
He did that. You're probably talking about Beowulf, which was
That's it. Beowulf.
He did illustrations for a variety of different kinds of books. Many of them classics, some of them his own works, his own stories, which were essentially autobiographical and travel stories. And Beowulf was one of the sort of epic sagas that he did illustrations.
Big iron.
Yeah, those were lithographs that were used in that. That's a beautiful book. It was printed in an unusual typeface, hammer uncial, which is a typeface that almost looks like something out of the old Norse legends. So the books are really wonderful to see and collect. That was really my introduction to Rockwell Kent, was through his books, and gradually kind of moved into the prints and other art areas. Other questions? Yes, in his early career, mostly, there isn't a precise date, but I'd say prior to about 1925, drawings that he did for magazines such as Vanity Fair and Puck and a few other kind of whimsical magazines of the period. He did drawings, some of them advertising and some of them just little illustrations for poetry and so on. And he used this name, it's what we call a nom de brosse, a brush name for Hogarth. He used the name Hogarth Jr. Where he got that, I don't know. But every now and then you'll stumble across a book and you'll see that the artist was Hogarth Jr. and you'll say, I'll buy that because these other people don't know that's Rockwell Kent. And but the style is certainly unmistakably his work. That's good.
Do you think he wrote the text for Architect Comics because it seems to be working on Architect Comics?
Well, it's attributed to a man named Squires, who was a friend of his, and who did sign his name as author of the book. But Kent's name as illustrator was not on that book. That's that 1914 book, the first, the beautiful cover that we looked at from 1914. Kent, at that time, just did not think that was serious artwork. He wanted still to be a painter. He remained a painter all of his life, but he made his living really from the areas of artworks that we looked at, the graphic arts, the book illustration, and so on. And he never realized a lot of money from any of his paintings. I think that's a fair statement. Other questions? All right, I guess I'm out of here. Thank you very much.